Hey guys, tonight we arrive at a lonely 1890s lighthouse as dusk cools the stones and the sea breathes below. And yes, you probably won't survive this job if you hate stairs, wind, or your own thoughts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always comforting to know where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off the cart path and onto the headland with the kind of careful confidence you only get when the ground looks solid but feels ready to betray you. The grass is cropped short by salt wind and stubborn sheep, and the tower rises ahead, pale and cylindrical, as if it has been quietly waiting all afternoon just for you. You pause, not because anything dramatic is happening, but because this is the last moment before the shift claims you. The sun is sinking toward the waterline, and the air carries that clean, briny smell that suggests both freshness and the slow rusting of everything you own. You adjust your coat and feel the weight of keys in your pocket. They jingle with a sound that seems much too loud for a place like this, and you instinctively hush them, which is funny because there's no one here to hear you, unless you count the gulls, who absolutely do not care. One of them watches from a rock with the mild contempt of a creature that has seen many keepers come and go and survived all of them. You nod back, as if acknowledging a colleague. That's joke number one, by the way, because you will start talking to animals tonight, and you will pretend that's normal. This lighthouse is a working machine, not a romantic ornament, and in the 1890s that matters more than ever. Steamships crowd the sea lanes now, iron hulls replacing wood, and maritime traffic is heavier than it has ever been. A mainstream fact worth settling into: by the late 19th century, most major lighthouses use Fresnel lenses, those beautiful ringed glass marvels that bend light into a beam visible for miles. You don't need to understand the math to respect it. You just need to know that if you do your job right, someone out there won't meet a rock they were never supposed to meet. You walk the short distance to the door, boots crunching on gravel that's been hauled up here bucket by bucket over decades. The tower smells faintly of oil, even from outside, like a promise. You unlock the heavy door and step inside, where the temperature drops and the sounds of the sea soften, filtered through thick masonry. The interior greets you with a hush that feels intentional, as if the building itself is reminding you to slow down. This is not a place for rushing. This is a place for repeating the same small actions until they become a kind of prayer. There's a bench by the wall where you set down your cap. The stone beneath your hand is cool and slightly damp, and you think about how many other hands have done exactly this, probably with the same tiny sigh of relief. Lighthouse keepers in the 1890s often work 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, depending on staffing and weather. Some stations have multiple keepers rotating watches, others leave one person alone with the tower and their thoughts. Historians still argue whether isolation was the greatest hardship of the job or its greatest appeal, and standing here now, you can see both sides lining up politely to make their case. You glance at the logbook on the small desk near the door. It's thick, its pages warped slightly by years of coastal humidity, and you run a finger along the edge, feeling the subtle ridges of handwritten entries. Tonight, you'll add your own notes: wind direction, visibility, lamp condition. It's mundane, yes, but it's also how history gets recorded, one calm, unexciting sentence at a time. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into this ritual. Some keepers were fined or dismissed for sloppy logs because administrators believed poor handwriting indicated poor discipline. Your handwriting is fine, probably. You make a mental note to slow down, because apparently penmanship is now a character judgment. You take a moment to listen. The tower creaks faintly, settling into evening, and the wind hums around the exterior like a distant crowd that never quite cheers. It's easy to imagine the dramatic versions of this job, the storms, the rescues, but most nights are like this, defined by waiting. That's joke number 2. The most dangerous part of lighthouse keeping is not the sea, but boredom sneaking up on you with a pillow. You shake out your shoulders and remind yourself that boredom is actually a feature, not a flaw. A calm coast is a safe coast. Outside, the sky is deepening from blue to something softer, and the first star makes a cautious appearance. You step back out briefly to check the weather vane mounted near the base of the tower. Wind steady, nothing exciting, which is exactly what you want. In the 1890s, keepers are expected to be amateur meteorologists, reading clouds and barometers with an eye toward prevention. There's a debate among scholars about how accurate these local observations were compared to centralized forecasts just beginning to emerge. Historians still argue whether keepers' instincts saved more ships than early weather reports did, and you suspect the truth lives somewhere in between, like most things. You return inside and close the door gently, sealing yourself in with stone, iron, and responsibility. The lantern above you is still bark, waiting for the ritual that will come later, and you can almost feel its presence, like a ceiling-mounted moon. For now, though, your job is simply to arrive, to let the outside world fall away and the rhythm of the tower take over. You breathe in, slow and deliberate, and feel the day loosen its grip. One last glance at the logbook, one last adjustment of your coat, and you're ready. The night hasn't begun yet, not officially, but you can sense it stretching, preparing to settle in around the tower like a blanket that smells faintly of salt and oil. You smile to yourself, because despite everything, there's a small, quiet pride in being the person who shows up when everyone else is heading home. That's joke number 3, subtle but sincere. You're not avoiding the night, you're clocking in for it. The stairs await above, spiraling upward, but that's for later. For now, you stand in the base of the lighthouse, grounded, present, and just a little bit soothed by the idea that all you have to do tonight is keep the light ready. The rest will take care of itself, one unhurried step at a time.
You turn toward the spiral stairs, and for a moment, you just look at them, because it's polite to acknowledge the challenge before accepting it. The iron steps curl upward along the inside wall like a patient metal snail, disappearing into the dimness above. They're narrow, worn smooth in the center from decades of boots exactly like yours, and they have a faint sheen from oil, dust, and the kind of polish that only time can apply. You place one hand on the railing, which is cold and slightly tacky, and begin to climb. The first few steps are easy enough, and you settle into a rhythm almost immediately. Left foot, right foot, hands sliding along iron, breath matching movement. This staircase was not designed for drama, it was designed for repetition. A mainstream historical fact hums quietly in the background of your effort. Many 19th century lighthouses were engineered with spiral staircases specifically to strengthen the tower, distributing weight evenly and reducing wind resistance. Every step you take is doing double duty, supporting you and helping the entire structure stand up to the sea. No pressure, but you are now part of the architecture. As you climb, the sounds from below soften. The door at the base of the tower feels farther away than it actually is, and the sea outside becomes a low, steady murmur, like someone else's problem. The air changes too, cooler, drier, with a faint metallic tang. You can smell oil more clearly now, mixed with old stone and something almost dusty, even though dust never really settles properly this close to the ocean. You take another step, then another, and realize that the staircase encourages a certain pace. Rush it, and you'll regret it. Go slow, and it's almost meditative. Your boots echo softly, each footfall a small, contained sound that doesn't travel far. That's intentional. Designers knew that loud, resonant interiors could be distracting or even unsettling during long watches. Historians still argue whether these acoustic considerations were deliberate or simply a happy accident of thick masonry and curved walls. But standing here, you're grateful either way. The tower doesn't amplify you, it absorbs you. Joke number 1 slides in gently. If this were a modern gym staircase, there'd be a motivational sign by now telling you that the climb is the reward, which would be wildly unhelpful. Halfway up the first turn, you pause, not because you're tired, but because pausing feels like part of the ritual. You lean slightly into the wall, feeling its cool solidity through your coat. The stone is uneven in places, patched and repointed over the years, and you imagine the masons who worked here, hauling materials up this same spiral long before there was a proper crane. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into that image. Some lighthouse keepers doubled as maintenance workers, performing small repairs themselves, and a few were known to personalize the interior with carved initials or dates, tiny acts of rebellion against an otherwise uniform space. You scan the wall absently, half expecting to see JT 1874 scratched somewhere. You don't, but the idea lingers. You resume climbing, counting steps without meaning to. The number doesn't matter, it's the consistency that soothes you. Spiral staircases like this often vary in step height just slightly, a result of hand casting and on-site adjustments. Your body notices even if your mind doesn't, making micro-corrections that keep you balanced. It's oddly grounding, this quiet cooperation between muscle memory and uneven iron. Joke number 2, this is the original mindfulness exercise, except instead of a yoga mat, you get rust and responsibility. A small slit window appears briefly as you round another curve, offering a narrow view of the outside world. The sky has darkened further, the horizon now a soft gradient rather than a sharp line. You catch a glimpse of the sea reflecting the last of the light, and for a second it feels like the tower is moving and the world outside is rotating instead. You blink, smile to yourself, and keep going. This job has a way of gently messing with your sense of scale and orientation, especially at night. Some keepers reported feeling as if the tower swayed even in calm weather. Historians still argue whether this was psychological or the result of subtle vibrations from wind and waves, but either way, you file the sensation away under normal enough. Your breathing deepens as you climb higher, not labored, just steady. The stairs narrow slightly near the outer edge, a reminder to keep your steps centered. You imagine carrying supplies up here, oil cans, cleaning tools, replacement parts, and feel a renewed appreciation for the keepers who did this daily, sometimes multiple times a night. There's a reason lighthouse legs became a quiet point of pride. It wasn't about strength so much as endurance. Joke number 3 arrives politely. Skipping leg day was not an option unless you wanted to live permanently on the ground floor, which would defeat the entire purpose. Another turn, another small landing, and you notice a hook on the wall where a lantern once hung, long since removed or replaced. It's a small thing, but it speaks to layers of use, to changes made and forgotten. Lighthouse technology in the 1890s is in transition. Oil lamps are giving way to more efficient systems, and automation is on the distant horizon. There's debate among scholars whether keepers welcomed these changes or resented them as threats to their livelihood. Historians still argue whether automation ultimately improved safety or simply shifted risk elsewhere. But for now, the light depends entirely on human effort, one careful step at a time. As you near the top of the staircase, the air grows warmer, tinged with the faint promise of flame. The lantern room isn't visible yet, but you can feel it, like a presence above you. You slow your pace instinctively, savoring the transition.
Climbing these stairs isn't just about getting from one level to another. It's about leaving the ordinary world behind. Each step separates you a little more from land-based concerns and draws you closer to the quiet, circular universe of the light. You reach the final curve and stop again, hand resting on the railing, heart steady, mind calm. Below you, the tower holds its breath. Above you, the night waits to be illuminated. You straighten, ready for the work ahead, and take the last few steps with the same unhurried care that brought you here.
You step off the final stair and into the lantern room, and the space greets you like a familiar thought rather than a surprise. It's circular, orderly, and filled with the quiet confidence of things that know their purpose. The glass panes curve around you, still faintly warm from the day's sun, and the metal framework catches what little light remains outside. You pause automatically because this room rewards stillness. Every movement feels amplified up here, as if the lantern itself is paying attention. The great lens dominates the center, rising in concentric rings of thick, carefully cut glass. Even unlit, it has a presence, refracting the dim light into soft fragments that drift across the walls. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. By the 1890s, the Fresnel lens is the gold standard of lighthouse illumination, capable of focusing light far more efficiently than earlier reflector systems. It's not exaggeration to say this lens is the reason ships trust the coast. You circle it slowly, inspecting for dust, smudges, or anything out of place, because a single fingerprint can scatter light just enough to matter. Your routine here is practiced, almost ceremonial. You set down your tools on the small work table, each one landing with a soft clink that feels reassuring rather than intrusive. There's a cloth folded just so, a brush for the delicate grooves of the lens, and a small tin of polish that smells faintly of citrus and metal. You begin with the glass, moving slowly, methodically, letting the repetition quiet your thoughts. The world outside continues to darken, but in here, time stretches comfortably. There's a quirky tidbit hidden in this work. Some keepers believed the lens had a personality, responding better if treated with respect. They spoke to it, apologized if they bumped it, and swore it shone brighter on nights when it was properly minded. You don't go that far, but you do find yourself muttering a soft, "There we go," as you finish a particularly stubborn smudge. Joke number one slides in. If nothing else, talking to expensive glass makes you feel like you're doing your part. You check the burners next, crouching slightly to peer into the mechanism that will soon hold flame. The smell of oil is stronger here, rich and slightly sweet, and it clings to your clothes no matter how careful you are. Oil lamps in the 1890s require constant attention, wicks trimmed just right, fuel levels monitored, airflow adjusted. It's a balance of patience and precision. Historians still argue whether this hands-on maintenance made lighthouses safer or simply introduced more room for human error, but as you adjust the wick by a fraction, you're inclined to trust steady hands over distant oversight. The wind outside picks up just enough to make the glass panes hum softly, a low note that settles into the background like an ambient soundtrack. You glance out through one pane and see the sea shifting colors, deepening into blues and grays. The horizon is still visible, but it's soft now, blurred by the approaching night. You imagine a ship's captain glancing toward shore, waiting for the first flash of reassurance. That thought carries weight, but it's a manageable weight, like a well-fitted coat. You move to the clockwork mechanism that rotates the lens, checking the gears and weights. The system is elegant in its simplicity, gravity, gears, and careful timing. You wind the mechanism slowly, feeling the resistance build, listening for any irregular clicks.
everything sounds right. Another mainstream fact drifts in. Many lighthouse rotation systems of this era operate on precisely calculated intervals, creating unique light patterns that sailors use to identify specific towers. It's coastal Morse code, and you're the person making sure the message stays legible. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how consistently these patterns were maintained, especially in remote stations. Historians still argue whether minor variations in timing confused sailors or whether mariners adapted easily to small inconsistencies. You suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle, as usual. Tonight, though, you're aiming for perfection, or at least the closest thing to it that a human can manage after a long day. You straighten and stretch, rolling your shoulders gently. The lantern room is warmer now, anticipation building with the subtle rise in temperature. You take a moment to wipe your hands on a rag, leaving faint oil marks that will never quite wash out. That's okay. It's a mark of the job, like ink stains on a writer's fingers. Joke number 2 floats in lazily. If fashion ever asks, this is what functional chic looks like. Eau de kerosene with a hint of salt air. Outside, the first true darkness arrives, not suddenly, but like a curtain being drawn slowly, carefully, so as not to startle anyone. The sky deepens, stars sharpening into focus one by one. You feel the tower shift into its nighttime identity, and with it, you. The lantern room becomes less a workspace and more a command center, though that sounds grander than it feels. In reality, it's just you, the light, and a set of responsibilities that are oddly comforting in their clarity. You make a final circuit of the room, checking each pane, each bolt, each small detail. There's a rhythm to it that you could probably perform half asleep, and that's the point. Routine here isn't monotony, it's safety. Some keepers kept strict personal rituals, believing deviation invited mishap. Others were more relaxed, trusting experience over superstition. Historians still argue whether ritualized routines reduced accidents or simply made people feel more in control. As you finish your checks, you decide you're firmly in the why not both camp. You pause at the center of the room, hands resting lightly on the railing around the lens. The moment before lighting the lamp always feels slightly suspended, like the breath before a sentence. You take that breath now, slow and even, and let the calm settle in fully. The night is ready. So are you.
You strike the flame with a practiced motion, and for a brief, bright second, the match flares louder than you expect, like it's announcing itself. Then it settles, and you guide it carefully to the waiting wick. The lamp catches with a soft woof that's more felt than heard, and suddenly the lantern room has a heart. Light blooms outward, first tentative, then steady, filling the glass and waking the lens from its quiet patience. You watch closely, because this moment matters more than any other. A mainstream historical fact eases in as the flame stabilizes. Lighthouse lamps in the 1890s often burned whale oil earlier in the century, but by this time, many stations have transitioned to mineral oil or kerosene, which burns brighter and more consistently. The shift isn't just about efficiency, it's about reliability. You adjust the wick carefully, turning the knob by fractions until the flame sits just right, no flicker, no smoke. The smell changes subtly, cleaner now, and the warmth spreads evenly. The lens begins its slow rotation as you engage the clockwork, the gears ticking with a calm, deliberate rhythm. Light passes through the glass rings and emerges transformed, focused into a beam that stretches out over the darkening water. You follow it with your eyes as it sweeps the horizon, a quiet lighthouse heartbeat. Somewhere out there, a sailor sees it and relaxes just a little. You don't know who they are, and you never will, but the connection exists all the same. There's a quirky tidbit woven into this process. Some keepers claimed they could tell the health of the lamp by the sound it made, listening for subtle changes in the flame's whisper. You lean in slightly, listening, though you're not entirely sure what you're listening for. It sounds fine, or maybe that's just what you want to hear. Joke number 1 drifts in. Congratulations, you are now a professional flame whisperer, a career path that remains tragically underappreciated. You step back and let the light do its work, making small adjustments as needed. The lantern room glows, reflections bouncing off polished brass and curved glass, creating a soft, almost underwater feeling. Outside, the night has fully claimed the sky, and the beam cuts through it with calm authority. This is the part of the job that feels most like a performance, though your audience is invisible and mostly asleep. You imagine them nodding appreciatively, or at least not crashing, which is the real goal. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of lighthouse beams, comfort, reassurance, orientation, was as important as their practical function. Standing here, watching the light sweep steadily, you'd argue it absolutely was. Humans have always been drawn to fixed points in the dark, and this is one of the purest expressions of that instinct. You adjust the timing once more, ensuring the characteristic pattern remains consistent, and check the logbook note you'll later fill in. Lamp lit at dusk, flame steady. You take a moment to stretch your hands, fingers warming near the lamp, but never too close. Safety protocols are drilled into every keeper because accidents here escalate quickly. There's debate among scholars about how often keepers deviated from official procedures, especially during long, monotonous nights. Historians still argue whether strict adherence reduced accidents or whether experienced keepers knew when to bend the rules. You prefer not to test either theory tonight. The beam sweeps again and again, its rhythm settling into the background of your awareness. It's strangely hypnotic, and you have to remind yourself to stay alert at least a little. Joke number 2 slips in. Zoning out is encouraged emotionally, but discouraged professionally. You laugh quietly at yourself and refocus, checking the wick height once more for good measure. Outside the glass, the sea reflects the light in brief flashes, like scattered coins. You think about how far that light travels, how it leaps from lens to water to eye, bridging distances that would otherwise feel vast and empty. In the 1890s, this technology represents the cutting edge of coastal safety, and yet it relies on something ancient and simple: fire, tended by hand. That contrast sits comfortably with you, a reminder that progress often moves forward by carrying old ideas carefully along. You glance at the clock mounted near the mechanism. Time is behaving itself, moving forward in small, predictable increments. The night has officially begun, and your role has shifted from preparation to maintenance. The hard part, if you can call it that, is over. Now comes the long, steady watch, punctuated by checks and small adjustments. Historians still argue whether keepers preferred this phase or found it the most challenging, but for you, there's relief in knowing the light is lit and doing exactly what it's meant to do. You lean against the railing and take one last look at the flame, bright and calm. It doesn't need you constantly, just attentively. You nod to it, half joke, half habit, and step away to begin the quiet vigil that will carry you through the night.
You move closer to the glass panes and look out, letting the outside world press gently back into your awareness. The sea surrounds the tower on 3 sides, dark now, but never truly still, its surface shifting in long, patient motions. Wind sides around the lantern room, humming softly against the frame, and you feel the subtle vibration under your boots. It's not threatening, just present, like a reminder that the tower exists because this place is never entirely calm. Isolation settles in gradually,
Not with a dramatic thud, but with a soft click, like a door closing somewhere far below. You realize that for the next several hours, your world is defined by this circular room and the view beyond it. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your thoughts. Many lighthouse keepers in the 1890s lived on site with their families, but night watches were often solitary, even in staffed stations. The job required comfort with long stretches of quiet, something not everyone managed well. You manage it by leaning into the stillness rather than fighting it. You watch the beams sweep across the water, illuminating waves for a heartbeat before moving on. Each pass reveals a slightly different texture. Ripples here, a darker swell there, like the sea is changing outfits just for you. There's a strange intimacy in being the only person awake enough to notice these details. You feel both small and oddly important, which is a surprisingly comfortable combination. There's a quirky tidbit tied to this sense of isolation. Some keepers kept meticulous journals that went far beyond official logbooks, recording dreams, weather patterns, and philosophical musings. A few of these journals survive, offering historians rare glimpses into the inner lives of people whose work was meant to be invisible. You think about starting one yourself, then remember how tired you'll be by the end of the night. Joke number 1. Introspective writing sounds lovely until you've been awake since dawn and your pen starts drifting toward grocery lists. The wind shifts slightly, changing its pitch as it moves around the tower. You make a mental note of the direction, comparing it to earlier readings. Weather here is a constant conversation, and you're expected to listen closely. Historians still argue whether keepers' weather observations significantly improved maritime safety or simply provided anecdotal data, but there's no doubt they took the task seriously. You feel a small professional satisfaction in noticing the change, even if it doesn't amount to anything tonight. You step back from the glass and let your eyes adjust to the interior again. The lantern room glows warmly, the light reflecting off brass and iron in soft highlights. It's easy to forget how exposed this room really is, perched high above the rocks, surrounded by nothing but air and water. Yet inside, it feels secure, almost cozy. Joke number 2 floats in. If you ignore the height, the wind, and the responsibility, this is basically the world's most impractical reading nook. Your thoughts wander to the idea of isolation itself. In an age before constant communication, being alone meant truly alone. No telegrams arriving mid-shift, no voices carried over wires. If something went wrong, you handled it or you waited. Historians still argue whether this level of independence fostered resilience or simply hid mental strain, and you suspect both are true. You check in with yourself quietly and find that you're okay. The rhythm of the light helps. So does the knowledge that this solitude has a clear end. You glance down toward the base of the tower, imagining the solid door and the dark space below. It feels distant, almost theoretical, like a memory rather than a place you stood earlier. The sea continues its low conversation with the rocks, and the wind adds commentary. You listen without trying to interpret too much. Tonight doesn't require deep meaning, just attention. Another sweep of the beam, another quiet moment. You take a sip from your flask, the warmth spreading slowly. Joke number 3 arrives gently. Hydration is important, even when your main activity is standing around looking thoughtful. You smile, savoring the small comfort. The isolation no longer feels heavy. It feels earned. You've done the work to get here, lit the lamp, checked the mechanisms, and now the night is simply unfolding around you. You lean lightly against the railing and let your shoulders drop, knowing you'll check everything again soon, because that's how this job works. For now, though, you're content to stand in the glow, listening to wind and waves, a quiet witness in a very old conversation between land and sea. You turn away from the glass and focus on the less poetic but equally important side of the night: oil, wicks, and the quiet inventory of things that keep the light alive. There's a small storage area just off the lantern room, neatly organized because disorder up here has consequences. You open a cabinet and the smell deepens immediately: oil, metal, and a faint hint of old wood. It's not unpleasant. In fact, it's oddly comforting, like the scent of a workshop that knows exactly what it's for. You lift one of the oil containers carefully, feeling its weight and giving it a gentle shake. Plenty left. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you work. Lighthouse keepers in the 1890s were required to maintain strict fuel records, noting usage down to the pint. Fuel shortages weren't just inconvenient, they were dangerous, and administrators treated wasted oil almost as seriously as an unlit lamp. You set the container back in place, satisfied, and make a mental note for the logbook later. The wick trimmings come next. You remove the charred edge with small, precise snips, letting the burnt pieces fall into a tin. The motion is repetitive, soothing, and requires just enough attention to keep your mind from wandering too far. The smell shifts again, slightly smoky, slightly sweet, and you realize this scent will cling to you long after your shift ends. Joke number 1 drifts in lazily. Some people collect candles for relaxation. You collect the industrial strength version and wear it home. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into this task. Certain keepers believed the shape of the trimmed wick influenced the personality of the flame, and trimming styles varied from station to station. Flat, rounded, slightly peaked, each had its advocates. You don't subscribe to flame astrology, but you do have a preferred shape, learned through quiet trial and error. It's less superstition and more muscle memory, which feels like a reasonable compromise. You wipe your hands on a rag and notice the faint stains that never quite disappear. These marks are badges of repetition rather than honor, and you wear them without much thought. Historians still argue whether the physical toll of lighthouse keeping, constant climbing, exposure to fumes, and repetitive tasks shortened careers or simply shaped a particular kind of endurance. As you flex your fingers, you suspect it's both. Your hands feel capable, steady, and a little tired, which seems about right. The lamp continues its steady burn, and you watch the flame respond subtly to your adjustments. It's a quiet dialogue. You change something small, the lamp answers with a steadier glow. This back and forth becomes one of the night's anchoring routines. You check the air vents, ensuring proper flow, and listen for the faint change in sound that tells you everything's balanced. Joke number 2 appears softly. This is less like tending a fire and more like negotiating with one. You take another slow circuit of the room, eyes scanning for anything out of place. Lighthouse lamps demand respect, and complacency is the real enemy here. There's debate among historians about how often lighthouse fires occurred due to keeper error versus mechanical failure. Historians still argue whether stricter regulations reduced accidents or whether experience mattered more than rules. You lean toward experience paired with humility. The lamp doesn't care how long you've been here. It cares whether you're paying attention. You pause to rest your elbows lightly on the work table, breathing in the warm, oil-scented air. Outside, the wind continues its steady song, and the sea answers in low tones. Inside, the tower feels sealed, purposeful. The smells, once sharp, now feel familiar, almost grounding. You realize that scent is one of the strongest anchors of memory, and years from now, a whiff of oil might pull you right back here to this exact moment of quiet focus. Before moving on, you check your supplies once more, counting rags, tools, and spare parts. Everything has its place, and everything is in it. That order is calming in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't depended on it. Joke number 3 settles in gently. Minimalism is easy when every object can potentially ruin your night if misplaced. You close the cabinet and take one last look at the lamp, its flame steady and content.
The practical work is done for now, and you feel a small wave of satisfaction ripple through you. The light is fed, the wick is trimmed, and the night can continue without complaint. You step back into your quiet watch, carrying the comforting knowledge that, at least for this moment, everything smells exactly the way it should.
You settle into the first true watch of the night, that long, even stretch where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. The lamp is burning well, the lens turns with patient reliability, and the world outside seems content to behave itself. This is the phase of the shift that separates those who can keep watch from those who only like the idea of it. You lean lightly against the railing, eyes moving in slow patterns, following the beam as it sweeps, returns, and sweeps again. Boredom arrives politely, knocking rather than barging in. You acknowledge it, because ignoring it tends to make it louder. A mainstream historical fact slides into place. Lighthouse service manuals from the late 19th century explicitly warned against inattentiveness during calm conditions, noting that most mistakes happened when keepers assumed nothing would go wrong. The irony isn't lost on you. This job requires a kind of alert relaxation, a state that's surprisingly difficult to maintain. You shift your weight and let your gaze drift across the horizon. The sea looks endless from up here, but you know it's mapped, measured, and traveled constantly. Somewhere out there, a ship's crew is probably settling into their own routines, trusting that the coast will announce itself clearly and in time. You feel a faint sense of companionship in that shared rhythm, even though you'll never meet them. There's a quirky tidbit that makes its way into your thoughts. Some keepers brought small, repetitive tasks to the lantern room, knitting, carving, simple repairs, to help pass the hours without losing focus. Officially, this was discouraged, but unofficially it was tolerated as long as the light remained perfect. You don't have knitting needles, but you do find yourself straightening tools that are already straight, a tiny ritual that gives your hands something to do. Historians still argue whether boredom itself was a safety hazard or an unavoidable part of lighthouse life that keepers simply learned to manage. You suspect it's both. Boredom can dull the senses, but it can also smooth the edges of the mind, making space for quiet awareness. You let it settle around you without letting it take over, like a blanket you keep folded nearby rather than wrapped around your head. The clock ticks softly, marking time in a way that feels both precise and irrelevant. You check it, not because you need to, but because checking feels like part of the job. The minutes pass evenly, and you resist the urge to measure them too closely. Joke number 1 drifts in gently. If you stare at the clock long enough, it will absolutely slow down out of spite. You take another sip from your flask, warmth spreading comfortably, and let your eyes rest on the machinery. Everything moves as it should, and that reliability is deeply soothing. There's a quiet pride in maintaining something that doesn't ask for praise, only consistency. You think about how many nights like this have unfolded, each one blending into the next, forming a long, calm chain of vigilance. The wind outside eases slightly, changing the rhythm of its hum. You note the shift automatically, filing it away with the rest of the night's small details. Historians still argue about the extent to which keepers internalize these subtle changes, developing an almost instinctive sense of their environment. You don't feel especially instinctive, you just feel attentive, which seems good enough. You stretch, rolling your shoulders and flexing your calves, mindful of the hours still ahead. The tower responds with a soft creak, like an old companion acknowledging the movement. Joke number 2 slips in. Even the building appreciates a good stretch, apparently. You smile and settle back into place. The beam continues its steady sweep, and you let your breathing match its rhythm. This is the heart of the watch,
where time loses its sharp edges and becomes something you inhabit rather than track. You're not waiting for anything, you're simply being here, maintaining a presence that's both necessary and almost invisible. As the first watch draws on, you realize that this quiet is exactly what you signed up for, whether you knew it at the time or not. The world feels held together by small, careful actions, and you're part of that invisible stitching. Joke number 3 arrives softly. It's not glamorous, but it's oddly satisfying to be human duct tape for the coastline. You glance once more at the lamp, steady and bright, and feel a wave of calm settle in. The night stretches ahead, unhurried, and you're ready to keep pace with it, one slow sweep of light at a time. The night deepens enough that you start paying closer attention to the sky, not out of worry, but habit. Weather is never just background noise out here. It's a language, and you've been taught to read it with quiet respect. You step closer to the glass and tilt your head, studying the clouds as they drift past the stars. They're thin, moving steadily, nothing stacked or bruised looking. Calm for now. A mainstream historical fact settles gently into your awareness. In the 1890s, lighthouse keepers were often the most reliable local weather observers along the coast. Before standardized forecasts reached remote stations, keepers' notes helped build broader meteorological understanding. You glance instinctively toward where the barometer hangs below, even though you checked it earlier. Old habits don't need much encouragement. With weather comes superstition, whether you invite it or not. There's a quirky tidbit passed down through keeper folklore. Some believed certain cloud shapes foretold shipwrecks, while others swore that a halo around the moon meant trouble by morning. You spot a faint glow around the moon now, not dramatic, just a soft ring, and feel that familiar tug between reason and tradition. You tell yourself it's ice crystals and move on, but you still watch the horizon a little longer than strictly necessary. Historians still argue whether lighthouse superstitions affected decision-making or simply provided emotional structure during long, uncertain nights. Standing here, you suspect they did a bit of both. Superstition can be a shorthand for caution, and caution is never unwelcome. You don't change anything about the lamp, but you do double-check the rotation timing, just in case. Joke number 1 drifts in. Trusting science doesn't mean you can't also knock on wood, metaphorically speaking. The wind shifts again, this time bringing a cooler edge. You feel it even through the glass, a subtle pressure change that makes the tower sigh. You note the direction and speed, mentally updating the night's weather story. Nothing alarming, just the sea reminding you who's really in charge. You've learned not to take these shifts personally. You think about the keepers who came before you, trading stories on rare overlap days, passing along bits of wisdom wrapped in humor. Don't whistle indoors, they'd say. Don't count the steps out loud. Always greet the lamp before lighting it. You followed some of those traditions earlier without really noticing. Joke number 2 floats in softly. Turns out you're more superstitious than you thought, or at least politely compliant. Outside, the beam catches something briefly, a wave cresting higher than the rest, throwing back a flash of silver. Your heart jumps for half a second before settling. Nothing out of place, just water doing what water does. You remind yourself that vigilance doesn't mean panic. It means being present enough to notice, then letting go. The clouds thin further, stars sharpening as the night steadies. You feel a small sense of relief, though you hadn't realized you were tense. Weather watching is like that. You carry a low-level awareness until conditions prove they deserve your trust. Historians still argue whether this constant alertness wore keepers down over time or strengthened their resilience. You stretch your neck gently and decide that tonight, at least, it feels manageable. You step back from the glass, satisfied, and let the room's warm glow reclaim your focus. The lamp burns steadily, unbothered by clouds or folklore. You give it a small nod,
habit now more than humor, and return to your quiet watch, comforted by the knowledge that for the moment the sky is telling a calm story and you're listening just closely enough.
Midnight approaches without ceremony, announced only by the clock's steady ticking and a subtle shift in your own alertness. This is the hour when routines matter most, when the night is deep enough to encourage complacency, but long enough to punish it. You straighten slightly and move toward the clockwork housing, because this is when you check the machinery again, whether it seems necessary or not. You open the access panel and lean in, listening before touching anything. The gears murmur softly, a layered sound of metal meeting metal in slow, deliberate cooperation. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you observe. Many late 19th century lighthouses relied on weight-driven clockwork systems, similar in principle to grandfather clocks, to rotate their lenses. These mechanisms required regular winding, sometimes every few hours, to maintain consistent light patterns. You reach for the crank and begin winding with steady pressure, feeling the resistance build and release in a way that's both physical and reassuring. As the weights rise, you count the turns without consciously counting, a habit ingrained through repetition. The system responds with a slightly brighter confidence, if that's even possible. You close the panel gently and give the housing a light tap, more acknowledgement than test. Joke number 1 drifts in. You treat the machinery like a trusted coworker. Minimal small talk, maximum reliability. You inspect the bearings next, peering for signs of wear or oil seepage. Everything looks fine, but you wipe a spot anyway, because fine is not the same as ignored. There's a quirky tidbit attached to this diligence. Some keepers claimed they could predict mechanical failure days in advance based on tiny changes in sound or vibration. Whether that was skill or hindsight is up for debate. Historians still argue whether such intuitive maintenance actually prevented breakdowns or simply became legend after the fact. You listen again just in case and hear nothing but smooth operation. The lantern room feels different at midnight, quieter somehow, even though nothing has changed. The sea outside has settled into a slower rhythm, waves stretching out their movements like they're getting comfortable for the long haul. You glance out briefly, confirming the beam's sweep remains uninterrupted. It does, steady as ever, and you feel a small pulse of satisfaction. You move on to check the timing mechanism, comparing the rotation interval against the reference mark. It's exact, or close enough that no sailor would ever notice the difference. You make a mental note to log the check later, because documentation is part of the job, even if no one reads it for weeks. Joke number 2 slides in. Future administrators will absolutely appreciate your neat handwriting, or at least that's what you tell yourself. As you work, you're aware of the subtle physical toll of the hour. Your legs feel heavier, your shoulders a bit stiffer. This is normal. Lighthouse manuals acknowledged midnight as a low point for alertness, recommending movement and routine checks to stay sharp. You roll your shoulders and take a few deliberate steps around the room, keeping your body engaged enough to support your mind. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much autonomy keepers had in adjusting maintenance schedules. Historians still argue whether strict adherence to prescribed checks improved outcomes, or whether experienced keepers naturally optimized routines based on local conditions. You suspect the latter, because here you are, adapting the textbook to the reality of this particular tower on this particular night. You finish the machinery check and close the panel, hands lingering a moment on the cool metal. The lantern room returns to its steady glow, machinery humming contentedly. You take a slow breath and let it out, feeling grounded again. Midnight passes quietly, unmarked except by your awareness of it, and that feels exactly right. You return to your watch position, eyes drifting back to the horizon.
The light continues its calm sweep, the machinery its dependable work. You nod once, satisfied, and allow yourself to settle back into the night, knowing the heart of the tower is sound and the hours ahead can unfold without surprise. With the machinery humming contentedly again, your thoughts drift inward, and you find yourself reaching for the small stack of paper tucked neatly into a drawer beneath the work table. Letter writing is an unspoken tradition during these hours, a quiet counterbalance to the outward focus of the watch. You sit carefully on the narrow bench by the wall, positioning yourself so you can still glance up at the lamp without turning your head too far, multitasking, lighthouse style. You uncap your pen and pause, because starting is always the hardest part. What do you say when your world is a circle of glass and light, and the person you're writing to exists somewhere beyond the reach of the beam? A mainstream historical fact eases into the moment. In the 1890s, lighthouse keepers often relied on letters as their primary connection to the outside world, with mail delivered irregularly depending on weather and supply routes. Some stations received post weekly, others waited months. You begin anyway, because the act matters, even if the delivery doesn't. You write about small things: the weather, the steadiness of the lamp, the way the sea looked at dusk. These details feel safe, easy to share. You avoid anything that would sound like complaint, partly out of pride and partly because complaining feels louder on paper. There's a quiet understanding among keepers' families that this job comes with distance, both physical and emotional. Historians still argue whether this strain contributed to high turnover rates or whether families adapted over time, developing their own rhythms of absence and reunion. As you write, the pen scratches softly, a sound that blends easily into the background hum of the tower. You glance up periodically, checking the flame, the gears, the sweep of light. Everything remains steady, and that steadiness seeps into your handwriting, smoothing out the letters. Joke number 1 slips in gently. Your penmanship improves dramatically when the alternative is staring at the same wave for the 100th time. There's a quirky tidbit tied to these letters. Some keepers wrote multiple drafts of the same letter over several nights, revising as their mood shifted, then sent them all at once. Others never sent them at all, tucking them away as private records of thought rather than communication. You consider that for a moment, then decide this one will go. Even if it arrives late, it will arrive with honesty, which feels important. You set the pen down and reread what you've written, resisting the urge to overthink it. The words are simple, unadorned, and true enough. You fold the paper carefully and slip it into an envelope, sealing it with a practiced motion. The small act brings a surprising sense of closure, as if you've anchored yourself to something beyond the tower. You stand and stretch, rolling out the stiffness in your back. Midnight has fully settled now, and the world feels held in a kind of suspended quiet. The beam continues its sweep, unwavering. Joke number 2 drifts in softly. If this light had emotions, it would be the calmest one in the room, and that's saying something. You return the letter supplies to their place and take a slow circuit of the lantern room, eyes scanning for any changes. None appear, which is exactly what you want. You feel the gentle tug of fatigue at the edges of your awareness, but it's manageable, balanced by routine and purpose. Before resuming your watch, you allow yourself one small moment of reflection. You think about the unseen network of people connected by this light: sailors, families, other keepers on distant coasts, each doing their part in parallel isolation. Historians still argue whether this sense of shared duty was consciously felt by keepers or simply inferred later, but standing here now, you feel it quietly, like a low hum beneath everything else. You take your place again by the railing, letter written, lamp steady, and night unfolding exactly as it should. The tower feels a little less lonely now, and you carry that subtle comfort with you as the watch continues. You notice the first distant ship not because it announces itself, but because the light behaves differently for a moment. The beam sweeps out, vanishes into darkness, then returns with a brief, sharp reflection that doesn't belong to waves or foam. You straighten slightly and focus, eyes narrowing just enough to bring the horizon into clearer relief. There it is, a low, moving shape, almost indistinguishable from the sea except for the way it interrupts the light. A mainstream historical fact drifts in as you watch. By the 1890s, maritime traffic along major coasts has increased dramatically, with steamships and sailing vessels sharing crowded routes. Lighthouses don't just warn ships away from danger, they help them confirm where they are. Identification matters. You time the flashes instinctively, counting the seconds between sweeps, knowing that the pattern itself is part of the message. You watch the vessel's response, subtle but readable. Its course shifts slightly, the angle changing just enough to tell you they've seen the light and understood it. That small adjustment feels oddly personal, like a nod exchanged across miles of dark water. You don't wave, there's no point, but you do stand a little taller because your presence has just mattered in a measurable way. There's a quirky tidbit wrapped up in this silent exchange. Before radio communication became common, ships sometimes signaled lighthouses with lanterns or flares, not to ask questions, but simply to acknowledge receipt of the light's guidance. Not all keepers approved of this practice. Some found it distracting, others reassuring. You don't see any signals tonight, just the quiet confidence of a course correction, which suits you fine. Historians still argue whether sailors relied more on lighthouse patterns or on their own charts and experience, especially during clear weather. Watching this ship pass, you suspect the answer depends on the night. Charts tell you where you are, lights tell you you're not alone. You follow the ship's slow progress until it drifts beyond the strongest reach of the beam, becoming once again just another suggestion of movement in the dark. You note the sighting mentally, preparing to log it later. Officially, keepers recorded unusual activity or incidents, but many also noted routine passages, especially during busy seasons. It gave structure to the night and a sense of participation in the wider world. Joke number 1 drifts in. People talk about seeing the world, but tonight the world politely sails past you instead. The sea settles back into its earlier rhythm, and the horizon empties. You don't feel disappointed. There's comfort in knowing the light works whether anyone is watching it or not. You take a slow breath and let your shoulders relax again, returning to your quiet stance by the railing. Another sweep of the beam, another pass over open water. This time there's nothing to catch it, and that's fine. You think about how many of these interactions go unnoticed, unrecorded, yet still shape outcomes. Ships adjust, coastlines are avoided, lives continue uninterrupted. Historians still argue whether the true impact of lighthouses can ever be fully measured, given how much success looks like nothing happening at all. You glance briefly toward the signaling equipment mounted nearby, flags and lanterns rarely used at night, but kept ready just the same. Redundancy is part of the job. You don't touch them, there's no need. The lamp and lens are doing their quiet work perfectly. You return your gaze to the sea, letting the night reclaim its calm. The ship is gone now, swallowed by distance, and the tower resumes its steady conversation with wind and waves. You feel a small, settled satisfaction, the kind that comes from doing something important without fanfare. The watch continues unbroken, and you remain exactly where you need to be, present, observant, and content to let the light speak for you. The cold creeps in quietly, not as a dramatic drop, but as a slow negotiation between warmth and exposure. You notice it first in your fingers, then in your knees, the kind of chill that suggests it plans to stay a while. This is the hour when comfort becomes a tool rather than a luxury. You move toward the small shelf where your tin cup waits and pour yourself a careful measure of coffee from the insulated flask, steam rising briefly before vanishing into the lantern room's glow. A mainstream historical fact settles in with the warmth. Caffeine was a common ally for lighthouse keepers, though coffee and tea weren't always guaranteed supplies at remote stations. Some keepers relied on roasted grains or other substitutes when shipments ran late. You take a sip and feel the heat spread, grounding you again in your body. It's not fancy, but it's effective, and right now, that's enough. You pace slowly around the room, letting movement work the stiffness out of your legs. Staying warm is partly about circulation and partly about not letting stillness turn into lethargy. The machinery hums steadily, the lamp unwavering, and you match your steps to that rhythm without really thinking about it. Joke number 1 drifts in gently. This is what passes for cardio when your workplace is a very tall cylinder. There's a quirky tidbit tied to these cold hours. Some keepers swore by peculiar warming rituals, mustard plasters, special wool blends, even mild exercise routines invented on the spot. One story claims a keeper danced small, careful steps around the lantern room to stay awake, insisting it improved both morale and circulation. You don't dance, but you do flex your ankles and roll your shoulders, quietly thankful no one is here to comment on your technique. You pause near the glass and watch your breath fog faintly for a moment before dissipating. Outside, the sea reflects the beam in brief flashes, and the wind has settled into a low, steady push. Historians still argue whether exposure to cold contributed significantly to long-term health issues among keepers, or whether their layered clothing and routines mitigated most risks. You tug your coat a little tighter and decide that tonight, at least, you're managing fine. The coffee does its work, sharpening your focus just enough to counter the heaviness creeping in at the edges of your thoughts. Drowsiness is a familiar opponent by now, one you respect rather than fear. Lighthouse manuals acknowledged this battle, recommending brief mental resets, counting flashes, reviewing procedures, anything to keep the mind gently engaged. You count the beam's rotations once, then stop before it turns into a chore. Joke number 2 slips in softly. Staying awake is easier when you don't argue with the fact that you're tired. You accept it, adjust around it, and keep going. The tower seems to approve, responding with its usual calm creaks and murmurs. You take another sip of coffee, slower this time, and let your gaze drift across the interior. Everything looks exactly as it should. There's comfort in that sameness, in knowing that the night hasn't asked for anything unexpected. Historians still argue whether monotony was more taxing than crisis for lighthouse keepers, but standing here now, you'd choose monotony every time. The cold recedes slightly as your body warms from movement and caffeine. You settle back into your watch position, posture relaxed but attentive. The beam continues its patient sweep, and you let your breathing slow to match it. The hours ahead are still long, but they feel manageable, parceled out into small familiar tasks. You glance once more at the lamp, then at the clock, and smile faintly. You're awake, warm enough, and exactly where you need to be. The night can do what it likes. You're prepared to meet it one quiet minute at a time.
Somewhere after midnight, when the night feels fully settled and the hours ahead still stretch wide, the stories start to surface. You don't invite them exactly. They just drift in, carried on the same mental currents as memory and imagination. Lighthouse folklore has a way of doing that, especially when the tower creaks at just the wrong moment. You pause, listening, and remind yourself that old buildings always make noise. Always.
Even so, you listen a second longer than necessary. A mainstream historical fact settles gently alongside the unease. Lighthouse keepers in the 19th century often shared stories of hauntings, strange lights, and unexplained sounds, particularly at isolated stations. Some of these tales were recorded officially, others passed down informally during training or supply visits. You've heard a few yourself, usually delivered with a straight face and a barely concealed smile. Whether they were meant as warnings or entertainment was never entirely clear. You glance toward the stairwell, where shadows gather in a way that feels more intentional than it probably is. The light from the lantern room doesn't quite reach down there, leaving the steps to fade into darkness after the first few turns. You know what's down there: stone, iron, empty space. Still, the imagination has a habit of adding details when given the opportunity. Joke number 1 arrives softly. If something were going to get you tonight, it would have picked a more dramatic entrance. There's a quirky tidbit tied to these stories that always stuck with you. Some keepers believed that the spirits said to haunt certain towers were actually former keepers who refused to leave their posts, continuing their watch out of duty. It's oddly comforting in a way, a ghost who just really loved the job. You smile at the thought and feel the tension ease slightly. Historians still argue whether these stories reflect genuine belief or were coping mechanisms for isolation and stress. Standing here now, you lean toward the latter, though you wouldn't say no to a little mystery. After all, a job like this invites imagination. Long nights, limited company, and a building that feels alive enough to breathe on its own. It's fertile ground for stories. The wind picks up briefly, rattling one of the panes just enough to make you jump before you catch yourself. You exhale slowly, shoulders relaxing. Outside, the sea answers with a deeper rush of sound, waves stacking and releasing against the rocks below. Nothing supernatural, just the natural world reminding you it's still in motion. You return your attention to the lamp, its steady flame a reliable anchor. The light hasn't flickered, the machinery hasn't missed a beat. Whatever stories the night wants to tell, the tower remains focused on its task. Joke number 2 drifts in. Ghosts, if they exist, would probably appreciate a well-maintained lens. You think about the keepers who worked this station decades before you, each leaving behind their own layer of presence. Not ghosts exactly, but traces, worn steps, smoothed railings, habits passed down without names attached. That kind of continuity can feel eerie if you let it, but it can also feel grounding. You're not alone in this work, even if you are the only one here tonight. Another sound echoes faintly from below, a settling creak this time, slower, deeper. You don't flinch, you recognize it now, part of the tower's nightly conversation with gravity and temperature. Historians still argue whether keepers' heightened awareness at night led to exaggerated interpretations of ordinary sounds. You nod slightly, satisfied with the explanation, and move on. You take a slow walk around the lantern room, letting movement break the stillness. The shadows shift with you, behaving exactly as shadows should. The beam continues its sweep, indifferent to stories and superstitions. You find that comforting. The light doesn't care what you believe. It just needs you to do your job. As the folklore fades back into the background, you feel calmer, almost amused by your own momentary tension. Joke number 3 settles in gently. Turns out the scariest thing about lighthouse stories is how convincing your own brain can be at 3 in the morning. You return to your watch position, mind clearer, senses steady. The night still has hours left, but it feels less heavy now, its mysteries filed away where they belong. The tower stands solid around you, the light unwavering,
And whatever stories linger, do so quietly, content to let you keep working in peace.
You shift your focus toward the less glamorous corner of the lantern room, where the backup equipment waits patiently for a crisis that may never come. Storm lamps, spare wicks, extra oil tins, everything arranged with the quiet optimism that preparation makes emergencies unnecessary. You check them anyway, because this is the hour when preparedness becomes a form of reassurance rather than paranoia. A mainstream historical fact settles in as you lift one of the storm lamps. By the 1890s, lighthouse authorities required multiple redundant lighting systems, knowing that a single failure could have catastrophic consequences. Storm lamps were designed to withstand heavy wind and rain, their enclosed flames protected by thick glass and metal housings. You inspect the lamp's seal, satisfied that it would do its job if called upon, then set it back gently. There's a quirky tidbit attached to these backups that always amuses you. Some keepers named their storm lamps, treating them like last resort companions. Others swore certain lamps were unlucky, refusing to use them unless absolutely forced. You don't name yours, but you do have preferences, and you gravitate toward the same lamp each time you check, as if familiarity alone might make it more reliable. Joke number 1 drifts in softly. If superstition counted as maintenance, this place would be invincible. You mentally rehearse emergency procedures, not because you expect to use them tonight, but because rehearsal keeps panic from sneaking in later. Fire, mechanical failure, sudden fog, each scenario has a response, written and memorized. Historians still argue whether rigid emergency drills improved outcomes or whether real emergencies always unfolded too unpredictably for plans to matter. You suspect drills matter most for the first few seconds, buying clarity while instinct catches up. You glance out at the sea again, reassured by its relative calm. Storms announce themselves out here with plenty of drama, and tonight has shown none of that flair. Still, you check the weather signs once more, confirming nothing has shifted. Preparedness doesn't mean expecting disaster. It means respecting possibility. You move on to the spare parts, bolts, small tools, replacement fittings, and confirm they're all accounted for. The act feels almost meditative, like counting breaths. Joke number 2 floats in gently. You've never been so emotionally attached to a box of hardware in your life. As you finish the checks, you feel a subtle easing in your chest. Everything is ready, which means you can relax just a fraction more. Historians still argue whether this constant readiness created chronic stress among keepers or whether familiarity bred confidence instead. Tonight, confidence wins. The systems are sound, the light is steady, and the night has been kind. You take one last look at the storm lamp before closing the cabinet, giving it a small nod of thanks for not being needed. Joke number 3 settles in softly. The best backup plan is the one that stays bored. You return to your watch position, posture easy, mind calm. The emergencies remain hypothetical, filed neatly away where they belong. The night stretches on, quiet and cooperative, and you're content to let it stay that way, knowing you're ready if it doesn't. The hours before dawn have a particular texture, softer somehow, as if the night is beginning to loosen its grip. You feel it before you see it, a subtle shift in the air that suggests the long vigil has passed its deepest point. The sea's rhythm changes too, waves smoothing out, their timing less insistent. You lean against the railing and let that calm settle into you, grateful for this gentle phase of the watch. A mainstream historical fact drifts into focus. Many lighthouse keepers considered the pre-dawn hours the most peaceful of the shift, when maritime traffic was minimal and weather patterns often stabilized. It was also when fatigue peaked, making calm both a blessing and a test.
You acknowledge the tiredness without letting it take over, adjusting your stance and breathing to stay comfortably alert. The beam continues its steady sweep, but now it feels less like a command and more like a reassurance. You notice how the darkness seems thinner, as if the light has worn it down over the course of the night. There's a quiet satisfaction in that thought, even if it's more poetic than literal. Joke number 1 drifts in. If darkness had an endurance limit, this lamp would definitely be winning. You take a slow walk around the lantern room, footsteps soft, letting movement reset your body. The warmth from the lamp balances the lingering chill, creating a comfortable middle ground. Outside, the horizon remains dark, but the sky above it has softened, stars fading just slightly. You don't rush to interpret this as morning. Dawn arrives in its own time out here. There's a quirky tidbit associated with these hours. Some keepers claimed they could hear birds stirring long before first light, a subtle chorus beneath the sea's voice. You pause, listening. Maybe there's something faint there, or maybe it's just the wind shifting again. Either way, the idea of life waking beyond the darkness feels comforting. Historians still argue whether this pre-dawn calm was genuinely safer or simply felt that way due to reduced visibility and traffic. Standing here, you decide it doesn't matter much. Calm feels calm, and that's enough. You let your shoulders drop another fraction, trusting the systems you've tended all night. You glance at the clock and note the slow progress toward morning. Time feels different now, less heavy. Joke number 2 slips in softly. Even the clock seems relieved it's almost done with the night shift. The tower responds to the temperature change with a few quiet creaks, settling into a new balance. You smile at the sound, recognizing it as a familiar companion rather than a cause for concern. The light remains steady, unwavering, as dependable as ever. As the quiet hours stretch on, you find yourself simply existing in the moment, not waiting, not anticipating, just being. This, you realize, is the true reward of the night shift, not the drama or the stories, but this deep, unhurried peace. Joke number 3 settles in gently. Meditation apps would charge a fortune for this atmosphere. You return to your watch position and let the calm carry you forward. Dawn is on its way, unhurried but inevitable, and you're content to meet it when it arrives, still standing in the glow of a job well done. As the night thins further, you turn your attention to the quiet maintenance that fits best into these calm hours. This is when you polish, straighten, and tend, not because anything is wrong, but because care is easiest when the world isn't demanding much from you. You retrieve a soft cloth and a small tin of polish, their familiar weight grounding in your hands, and begin with the brass fittings near the lens. A mainstream historical fact eases into the rhythm of the work. Lighthouse authorities in the 1890s expected keepers to maintain not only the function but the appearance of the lantern room. Clean brass and clear glass weren't vanity. They reduced corrosion and ensured maximum light efficiency. You work the cloth in small circles, watching dullness give way to a warm, muted shine. It's slow, repetitive, and deeply calming. The smell of polish mixes with oil and warm metal, creating a scent that feels specific to this hour. You breathe it in without thinking too much about it, letting the repetition settle your thoughts. There's a quirky tidbit tied to this task. Some keepers claimed they could judge the coming day's weather by how the metal responded to polishing, insisting it tarnished faster before storms. You don't fully believe that, but you do notice the brass behaves politely tonight, shining up without complaint. You move methodically from one fitting to the next, careful not to disrupt the lamp or its mechanisms. Each small task has a beginning and an end, and that contained sense of completion feels especially satisfying right now. Historians still argue whether these repetitive maintenance rituals helped keepers cope with isolation or simply filled time that might otherwise have dragged. As you polish, you lean firmly toward the first explanation. The cloth glides, your hands moving almost automatically now. You check your reflection briefly in the curved brass, distorted, softened, barely recognizable, and smile faintly. Joke number 1 drifts in gently. It's reassuring to know even your reflection looks tired by this point. You wipe down the glass frames next, careful around the edges where salt residue sometimes gathers despite the height. Living this close to the sea means everything carries a trace of it. You clean without rushing, letting the motion become its own quiet rhythm. The beam continues its sweep uninterrupted, indifferent to your small acts of care. Historians still argue whether the pristine appearance of lantern rooms influenced keeper morale or whether it was simply a byproduct of strict inspections. Tonight, you don't care why it matters. You just know that the order feels good. There's something deeply human about making a space neat when the rest of the world is asleep. You pause to stretch your fingers, then resume, finishing the last of the fittings. Joke number 2 slips in softly. This is the closest thing to housekeeping that also doubles as maritime safety. As you put the cloth away, you take a slow look around the room. Everything gleams just a little more than it did before, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for you to feel it. That's often how this job works, small improvements that never get credited, quietly supporting something larger. You return to your watch position, hands clean, mind settled. The maintenance is done, the night nearly spent. Dawn isn't here yet, but it's close enough that you can sense it, like a promise forming just beyond the glass. You notice the first visitor not with your eyes, but with a soft, irregular tapping against the glass. It's faint enough that you think it might be wind at first, but then it happens again, gentler this time, almost tentative. You turn slowly, careful not to startle whatever's found its way up here, and spot the small silhouette clinging to the outside of the pane. A moth, pale and persistent, drawn by the steady glow you've been tending all night. A mainstream historical fact settles in quietly as you watch it flutter and resettle. Lighthouse beams have long attracted birds and insects, especially during migration seasons. By the late 19th century, keepers were already noting these visitors in their logs, aware that the light could disorient as much as it guided. You feel a brief tug of sympathy for the moth, caught between instinct and illumination. More arrive soon, another moth, then a small beetle, their movements erratic but earnest. They circle, land, and lift again, tracing uneven paths across the glass. There's a quirky tidbit tied to this phenomenon. Some keepers believed the presence of insects foretold fair weather, while others swore it meant rain was coming. You don't draw conclusions, you just observe, letting the small drama play out without intervention. The real surprise comes a moment later when a bird, small, quick, and clearly confused, brushes the glass and veers away. Your heart jumps despite yourself. Birds are rarer at this hour, but not unheard of, especially during seasonal movements. Historians still argue whether lighthouses significantly disrupted migratory patterns, or whether their impact has been overstated in later studies. Standing here now, you feel the weight of that question in a very immediate way. You dim nothing and change nothing. The procedures are clear. The light must remain steady. You do, however, step closer to the glass, watching carefully, ready to note any further collisions. The bird doesn't return, and the moths continue their quiet dance. Joke number 1 drifts in gently. Turns out your night shift has a guest list, and none of them asked permission. The presence of these small creatures makes the lantern room feel less empty. You're still alone, but not solitary. There's something grounding about sharing the space, even briefly, with other forms of life responding to the same signal. You think about how the light means different things to different beings: safety, confusion, curiosity, and how little control you have over those interpretations. You recall reading that some keepers developed gentle routines for dealing with insects, carefully sweeping them away at dawn to prevent buildup. Others left them entirely alone, considering it bad luck to interfere. Historians still argue whether these practices were practical, symbolic, or simply personal preference. You make a mental note to check the panes later, when the light is extinguished and the visitors have moved on. The moth nearest you pauses, wings trembling, then drifts away into the dark, disappearing as quietly as it arrived. One by one, the others follow, leaving the glass clear again. The lantern room returns to its familiar stillness, though it feels subtly changed, as if the brief company left a trace of warmth behind. You step back into position, eyes returning to the horizon. Joke number 2 slips in softly. Hosting is exhausting, even when your guests are mostly wings and confusion. You smile and stretch your neck gently, easing the last of the stiffness. The sky has lightened almost imperceptibly now, the darkness thinning at the edges. The birds are gone, the insects dispersed, and the tower resumes its quiet conversation with wind and sea. You feel a renewed sense of calm, reminded that the night isn't just empty time, it's shared in small, fleeting ways. As you settle back into your watch, you carry that thought with you, content to be part of a larger, quieter network of movement and response, all centered briefly around this steady, patient light.
You notice the change not as a color, but as a softening. The darkness beyond the glass loosens its edges, and the horizon stops feeling like a wall and starts feeling like a distance again. First light doesn't arrive with ceremony. It seeps in, barely there, a suggestion more than a statement. You lean closer to the glass, not searching for it exactly, just acknowledging its approach. A mainstream historical fact settles gently into the moment. Lighthouse keepers often marked first light as an important reference point, noting visibility changes as daylight returned and navigation risks shifted. Dawn didn't make the light unnecessary immediately. Overlap mattered. You keep the lamp burning steadily, knowing that sailors still rely on it until the day fully takes over. The sea reflects this change almost shyly. Waves that were once black now carry hints of gray, then blue, their shapes easier to read with each passing minute. The beam still cuts across them, but it feels less dominant now, more cooperative, as if handing responsibility back to the sun. You watch this transition with quiet appreciation. Joke number 1 drifts in softly. The sun always arrives like it invented the place. You take a slow walk around the lantern room, checking the panes again, noting how the glass looks different in this early light, less reflective, more transparent. The world outside feels closer, less abstract. You spot distant shapes you couldn't see an hour ago. Maybe rocks, maybe just darker water. Either way, visibility is improving, and that's always a relief. There's a quirky tidbit tied to dawn watches. Some keepers claimed they could tell the quality of the coming day by the way first light touched the water, insisting certain hues meant calm seas ahead. You don't put much stock in that, but you do find yourself hoping for an easy morning. Historians still argue whether these observations were meaningful patterns or hopeful interpretations layered onto routine experience. You check the clock again, noting how close you are to extinguishing the lamp. Not yet, but soon. The thought carries a mix of satisfaction and mild reluctance. There's comfort in finishing a shift cleanly, but there's also something special about being awake when the world restarts itself.
Joke number 2 slips in gently. Most people call this morning. For you, it's more like a curtain call. The tower responds to the warming air with another quiet series of creaks, stone and metal adjusting as temperatures shift. You recognize the sounds instantly, no longer even registering them as noteworthy. They're just part of the tower's voice, changing tone with the hour. You glance down toward the land now visible below, paths and grasses emerging from shadow. The isolation that defined the night begins to fade, replaced by a sense of rejoining something larger. Historians still argue whether keepers preferred the solitude of night or the connection of day, and you suspect preferences changed with mood and season. This morning, you're content with the transition. You return to your watch position and let the last stretch of darkness pass without hurry. The beam continues its sweep, now less dramatic against the growing light, but no less precise. You stand quietly, present for the handoff between night and day, knowing your part in it is almost complete. As the horizon brightens further, you feel a gentle pride settle in. The light carried the night safely, and now it's nearly time to let it rest.
The moment arrives without a bell or announcement. It's simply time. The sky has shifted enough that the light no longer feels like the first voice anyone listens for, and you recognize that quiet cue immediately. You move toward the lamp with the same care you used to light it hours ago, aware that beginnings and endings deserve equal attention. A mainstream historical fact settles into the motion. Lighthouse keepers were required to extinguish the lamp at a specific level of daylight, not at sunrise itself, but when natural visibility clearly surpassed the beam's usefulness. Timing mattered. Too early, and you risked leaving a ship without guidance. Too late, and the light became visual noise rather than help. You judge the balance now, eyes flicking between horizon and flame. You reduce the flame gradually, easing it down rather than snuffing it outright. The lantern room changes immediately, warmth receding, shadows softening. The great lens, so dominant all night, begins to lose its authority, reflections fading into ordinary glass. There's a strange tenderness to this part of the job, like putting something to sleep after it's worked hard for you. There's a quirky tidbit tied to extinguishing the lamp that always stuck with you. Some keepers believed blowing out a lamp was disrespectful, preferring to starve the flame slowly instead. Others insisted a clean, decisive end was better. You follow the method you were taught, careful and controlled, letting the flame shrink until it disappears on its own. Joke number 1 drifts in gently. Even fire appreciates a graceful exit. The machinery continues to tick for a moment after the flame is gone. Then you disengage it, the rotation slowing until the lens comes to rest. The silence that follows feels deeper than any you experienced during the night. It's not empty, just complete. You stand still, listening, letting the finality settle. Historians still argue whether keepers felt relief or loss at this moment, ending a shift that demanded so much quiet attention. Standing here now, you feel a mix of both, relief that the responsibility has passed safely, and a faint sense of absence where the steady glow used to be. You glance once more at the horizon, now fully readable in daylight tones, and remind yourself that this transition is the goal, not the interruption. You make a brief note in the logbook, recording the extinguishing time with the same neat care as everything else. The ink looks darker in daylight, the page less mysterious. It's just a record now, not a promise. Joke number 2 slips in softly. Paperwork always feels more powerful at night. You check the lamp assembly once more, ensuring everything is secure and ready for the next lighting. Maintenance doesn't stop with daylight, it simply shifts focus. You wipe your hands on a rag, noticing how tired they finally feel, as if they waited until permission was granted. Outside,
The sea has fully claimed its morning colors, and the birds you noticed earlier are likely moved on to other distractions. The tower feels less like a sentinel now and more like a building again, its magic temporarily set aside. Historians still argue whether lighthouses lost something intangible once daylight revealed their ordinary structure. You don't think so. They just shift roles quietly. You step back from the lamp and take a long, slow breath. The night is officially over, and you carried it through without incident. That feels enough.
You take your time leaving the lantern room because there's no reason to rush now. The urgency that carried you through the night has softened into something like quiet aftercare. You gather your tools, straighten the bench, and give the space one last slow look, not out of sentimentality exactly, but out of habit. This room held the night together, and you were part of that, whether anyone ever knows it or not. A mainstream historical fact settles gently into this final stretch. Lighthouse keepers in the 1890s were expected to leave the station ready for immediate reuse, regardless of how exhausted they felt. The next shift, whether later that evening or handled by another keeper, depended on this continuity. You check the cabinets, close them carefully, and confirm that everything is exactly where it should be. Order now is a kindness to your future self. You begin the descent down the spiral stairs, boots echoing softly in a way that feels different in daylight. The steps look less mysterious now, their worn centers clearly visible, their curves familiar rather than imposing. You move more slowly than you did on the way up, letting gravity do some of the work. Joke number 1 drifts in gently. Turns out stairs are much friendlier when they're not asking you to stay awake all night. As you descend, you feel the night settle into your body, not as fatigue alone, but as something earned. Your legs ache faintly, your shoulders carry a pleasant heaviness, and your thoughts move at an unhurried pace. Historians still argue whether this post-shift exhaustion was one of the job's greatest challenges or one of its quiet rewards. Right now, it feels like both, layered together in a way that's hard to separate. You reach the base of the tower and pause, hand resting briefly on the cool stone wall. The interior smells different in daylight, less oil, more damp stone, and the sounds from outside are clearer now. Birds call from somewhere nearby, and the sea sounds less secretive, more conversational. You open the door and step out onto the headland, blinking slightly as full morning greets you. The world looks ordinary again, and that feels like success. The grass moves gently in the breeze, the rocks sit exactly where they did yesterday, and the sea continues without drama. There's a quirky tidbit tied to this moment. Some keepers reported a strange sense of displacement after night shifts, as if the daylight world belonged to someone else. You feel a hint of that now, like you're arriving late to a party that never stopped. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keeping fostered a lifelong attachment to solitude, or whether most keepers were simply relieved to rejoin everyday life. As you step away from the tower, you decide there's room for both. You're glad to be done, and glad you did it. You glance back once at the lighthouse, its lantern now dark, its purpose temporarily paused. In daylight, it looks almost modest, a practical structure rather than a beacon, but you know what it does when needed, and that knowledge stays with you. Joke number 2 slips in softly. Impressive things rarely look impressive when they're resting. You make your way along the path, boots crunching on gravel, each step carrying you farther from the night. The responsibility lifts gradually, not at once, and you let it go piece by piece. By the time you reach the edge of the headland, you feel lighter, quieter inside. Before you fully leave, you stop and take one more look at the sea, now bright and open. Ships will pass today without ever noticing the tower, and that's exactly how it should be. Historians still argue whether the true legacy of lighthouses lies in their engineering, their symbolism, or their keepers. You think it lies in mornings like this, calm, uninterrupted, and quietly safe. You turn away at last, ready for rest, carrying the night with you, not as a burden, but as something gently completed. Now, as the day continues without you needing to watch it, everything slows just a little more. Your breathing evens out, the sounds around you soften. The tower stands behind you, patient and still, waiting for the next dusk. There is nothing more you need to do. You showed up, you kept the light steady, you let the morning arrive. Let your thoughts drift now, unanchored by duty. Let the rhythm of waves you no longer need to watch fade into memory. The night has passed safely, and so have you. There's rest ahead, deep and unhurried, and it's well deserved.